My name is Zoe, and I am 29 years old. My sister recently announced her third pregnancy, and my parents cheered like she had just won a massive lottery. My mother slammed her hand on the table and shouted that another baby meant another huge party, and then she pointed right at me. She told me I would handle the older kids while they celebrated. My father glanced at me, expecting my usual silent obedience. Instead, I asked why that was my responsibility. My sister snapped that I was single and free, so I should consider it training for when I finally found a man. I did not argue. I packed my bag and walked out the front door. The next afternoon, an unknown number called my phone. The voice on the other end said, "Good afternoon. I am calling from the Atlanta Police Department. Someone has abandoned 2 children at the Ritz-Carlton and your name is on the note. I work as a crisis public relations and financial fixer. I spend my days cleaning up disastrous messes for millionaires and corporate clients, but the biggest mess I ever had to clean up was my own family." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who treated you like a bank instead of a human being. To understand how we ended up with the police calling me about abandoned children, we have to go back exactly 24 hours to the annual anniversary gala for my father's megachurch. Growing up as the daughter of Pastor Calvin and First Lady Brenda in Atlanta meant living in a very public fishbowl. Our family was supposed to be the shining example of community excellence and faith, but behind the stained glass windows and designer church hats, emotional coldness and financial manipulation permeated every corner of our lives. My childhood bedroom was a sanctuary where I hid from the constant demands of appearing perfect for the congregation. From elementary school through college, I maintained straight grades and built my own career entirely without their help, yet they always expected me to fund their illusions of grandeur. The gala was not just a dinner, it was a high-stakes fundraiser disguised as a celebration of the community. The massive fellowship hall was dripping in gold decorations, towering white floral centerpieces, and hundreds of wealthy donors from across the city. I was seated at the exclusive family table, wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than my mother's entire outfit. Though I never said that out loud, I was just trying to eat my catered salmon in peace and leave as early as politely possible. My sister Jada, who was 33 and heavily pregnant with baby number 3, sat directly across from me. Jada was a mommy influencer with 500,000 followers on social media. She portrayed the perfect traditional wife life online, constantly posting curated photos of her flawless family. But in reality, she could not even manage to keep her own children quiet during the opening prayer without handing them a tablet. Her husband DeAndre sat next to her wearing a loud designer jacket and flashing a fake gold watch. DeAndre called himself a crypto entrepreneur. In our community, that was just a fancy way of saying he spent his wife's money, attended networking mixers, and contributed absolutely nothing of actual value to the household. My father took the microphone on the main stage. His booming, charismatic voice echoed through the hall as he praised the Lord for the church's success over the past decade. Then he turned his attention to our table. He announced to the entire room that Jada and DeAndre were expecting their third child. The room erupted in joyful applause. My mother, sitting right next to me, beamed with pride, adjusted her diamond necklace, and waved graciously at the congregation. Then my father looked down from the stage directly at me. He smiled a wide, artificial smile that I knew all too well. It was a smile that meant a trap had been set. He told the crowd that families must always support each other. Without any prior warning, he announced that I, the successful business owner of the family, would be making a special $50,000 donation to DeAndre's new youth crypto ministry to help support their growing family. The applause grew deafeningly loud. Hundreds of expectant eyes turned to me. They fully expected me to stand up, smile gracefully, and pull out my checkbook. It was a classic manipulation tactic. My father thought that by putting me on the spot in front of the entire church, the mayor and local politicians, I would be too embarrassed to refuse. He thought I would just hand over my hard-earned money to fund DeAndre's fake business and subsidize Jada's extravagant lifestyle to avoid a public scene. I placed my fork down on my plate. The clinking sound was barely audible over the clapping, but my mother heard it. She leaned over and whispered through her clenched teeth, telling me to stand up and wave immediately. She said I owed it to the ministry, to my sister, and to the family. I did not stand up. I did not wave. I looked my mother dead in the eye and told her I was not giving DeAndre a single dime of my money. The applause started to die down when people realized I was not playing along. My father's confident smile faltered. He tried to laugh it off, making a quick joke into the microphone about how the youngest child is always the most stubborn and fiercely independent, but the tension in the room was rapidly becoming suffocating. Jada's face turned bright red. She could not stand the fact that the spotlight was shifting from her glorious pregnancy announcement to my public refusal. She slammed her hands flat on the table, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle violently. She leaned across the massive floral centerpiece, glaring at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. She asked me what my problem was. She said I had more money than I knew what to do with while she was doing important work by bringing a new life into the world. She told me I was deeply selfish and broken inside. I kept my voice low, cold, and completely steady. I told Jada that having children was a choice, and it was her choice, not mine, to finance. I told her that DeAndre needed to get a real job instead of begging for my money under the guise of a spiritual church ministry. DeAndre puffed out his chest and tried to look intimidating, but I could see he was sweating under the chandelier lights. He told me to respect my elders and respect the church authority. I just laughed a short, humorless laugh. I told him respect is earned through hard work, not bought for a $50,000 ransom. My mother grabbed my arm under the table, her manicured acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin. She hissed that I was embarrassing the family in front of our most important donors. She said I was incredibly lucky they even invited me to sit at the exclusive table. She told me pity goes a long way, and I should be grateful they still claimed me considering I was almost 30, unmarried, and completely alone in the world. That was the breaking point. The sheer audacity of her statement hung heavy in the air. They were trying to publicly extort $50,000 from me, yet they acted like they were doing me a massive charitable favor by simply letting me sit in their presence. Jada lost whatever remaining emotional control she had. She grabbed her heavy crystal glass of red wine and threw it directly at my face. I have spent years managing chaotic crises for massive corporate clients. My reflexes are extremely sharp. I stepped back just in time and the red wine missed my expensive silk blouse, shattering violently on the marble floor right next to my designer heels. The terrible sound of breaking glass echoed through the suddenly silent fellowship hall. Loud gasps erupted from the surrounding tables. Jada stood there, chest heaving, screaming that I was just bitter and jealous. She yelled that I was jealous of her perfect marriage, her beautiful children, and her family values. She shouted that no amount of corporate money or business success would ever make me a real woman because I could not even keep a man interested in me. The entire church congregation was staring in shocked silence. My father was frozen behind the wooden podium on stage. My mother was frantically trying to apologize to the mayor's wife, who was seated directly at the next table, over dabbing a tiny drop of spilled wine from her dress. I looked at the shattered glass, the dark wine pooling on the pristine white marble, and then at my sister's furious, entitled face. I felt no sadness. I felt no urge to cry or scream back. The emotional coldness that had permeated my entire childhood had finally crystallized inside me, turning into an impenetrable shield they could no longer break. I calmly picked up my leather purse. I looked directly at Jada and told her that real family values do not cost $50,000. I told her good luck with the new baby and good luck paying her own bills from now on. I turned around and walked out of the massive fellowship hall. I did not look back. I did not rush my steps. I walked with my head held high, my heels clicking rhythmically and confidently against the floor, leaving them to marinate in the absolute public disaster they had just created for themselves. When I got to my car in the reserved parking lot, my phone was already blowing up with dozens of text messages from my mother. She was demanding that I come back inside immediately and apologize publicly for making Jada upset. She said I had ruined the holy atmosphere of the anniversary gala and humiliated my father. I simply muted her notifications, started my engine, and drove back to my quiet penthouse downtown. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had successfully established my boundaries and finally cut off their financial supply for good. I assumed they would give me the silent treatment for a few months, just like they always did when they did not get their way. I went to sleep that night feeling surprisingly peaceful, completely unaware of the wicked trap they were setting for me. I had no idea that while I was peacefully sleeping, Jada and DeAndre were frantically packing their designer suitcases. I had no idea they were booking expensive first-class tickets to the Bahamas for a luxurious tropical vacation. And I certainly had no idea that they were planning to leave their 5-year-old and 3-year-old children sitting alone in the busy lobby of a luxury hotel downtown, with nothing but a handwritten note with my name on it. The next afternoon, when that unknown number flashed on my phone screen, I answered it with my standard professional greeting. But the voice on the other line was not a distressed corporate client. It was an officer from the Atlanta Police Department. He asked if he was speaking to Zoe. I confirmed my identity, my heart rate picking up slightly. He took a deep breath and told me that he had 2 small children sitting in his precinct. He said the children claimed I was their aunt, and the hotel staff had found a note saying I would be arriving shortly to pick them up and settle a $4,000 hotel tab. The police officer asked how quickly I could get downtown. He said if I did not arrive soon, he would have no choice but to officially contact Child Protective Services. My heart stopped. The sheer level of betrayal, manipulation, and pure entitlement washed over me like a wave of freezing ice water. Jada and DeAndre had not just crossed a familial boundary, they had committed an actual crime. And they were actively trying to force me to be their unpaid babysitter and their personal bank account by using the police and the welfare of their own children as leverage. They thought I would panic. They thought I would rush down there, pay the massive hotel bill quietly to protect the family name, and take the kids back to my apartment. They thought I was still the obedient, fearful daughter who would do absolutely anything to keep the church's flawless reputation intact. They were incredibly wrong. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car until my knuckles turned white. The drive from my downtown office to the Ritz-Carlton took exactly 12 minutes, but my mind raced through 1,000 different crisis management scenarios. This was not a misplaced purse or a forgotten birthday. This was literal child abandonment. When I pulled up to the grand entrance, the valet rushed to open my door, completely unaware of the absolute storm brewing inside me. I handed him the keys and walked through the heavy glass doors into the opulent lobby. The Ritz-Carlton was a masterpiece of polished marble, crystal chandeliers, and quiet luxury. But right in the center of the lavish seating area, completely shattering the elegant atmosphere, were 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers standing awkwardly next to a plush velvet sofa. Sitting on that sofa were my 5-year-old nephew Leo and my 3-year-old niece Mia. They were clutching their small tablets, their faces smeared with what looked like dried chocolate from breakfast, swinging their legs above the expensive Persian rugs. A tall officer with graying temples saw me approaching his perimeter and stepped forward holding a piece of hotel stationery in his hand. He had the exhausted look of a man who had seen too many terrible parents in his career. He asked if I was Zoe. I nodded, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely neutral, masking the furious pounding of my heart. He let out a heavy sigh and handed me the piece of stationery. It was penned in Jada's distinctive loopy handwriting, the exact same handwriting she used to sign merchandise for her followers. The note was brief, chillingly casual, and entirely devoid of any maternal concern. It read, "Auntie Zoe will pick them up and pay the room tab. We desperately need a baby moon to recharge our spirits before baby number 3 arrives. See you in a week." I stared at the paper. A week. She had abandoned her toddlers in a hotel lobby to fly out of the country for an entire week. As a crisis public relations expert, my brain immediately started calculating the sheer legal liability of what I was reading. The officer watched my face closely, probably waiting for me to break down. Crying, scream in panic, or rush over to hug the children instead. I pulled my phone from my purse, opened my camera, and took 3 clear, high-resolution photos of the note in the officer's hand. I handed the paper back to him and asked how long the children had been sitting there. He told me the hotel staff noticed them alone in the breakfast dining area around 10 in the morning. Jada and DeAndre had checked out at 6 a.m. to catch an early international flight. They had simply left the kids sleeping in the bed, fully knowing the cleaning staff would eventually find them wandering and bring them to the lobby. They treated the Ritz-Carlton staff like an unpaid daycare service. Just then, the hotel duty manager approached us. He was a slick-looking man in a tailored charcoal suit, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He cleared his throat and held out a long, itemized receipt printed on premium paper. He told me that my sister had vacated the penthouse suite but left an outstanding balance of $4,000. She had charged premium room service, expensive spa treatments, and on-demand movies, then casually told the front desk that her wealthy sister would be arriving shortly to settle the account and collect the children. He smiled a tight, extremely forced smile and asked which credit card I would like to use to resolve the balance. This was the exact moment my family expected me to cave. In the Black church community, I grew up in family business, was supposed to stay strictly inside the family. You covered for each other, you hid the ugly truths behind closed doors, and you paid whatever price was necessary to keep the police and government authorities out of your personal lives. Jada and DeAndre were banking heavily on that cultural conditioning. They were banking on my fear of public embarrassment and my desire to protect the church's pristine image. I looked at the manager's outstretched hand, then at the police officer. I spoke in the exact same cold, authoritative tone I use when negotiating hostile corporate buyouts. I told the manager I would not be paying a single cent of that $4,000 bill. I clearly explained that I did not sign a contract with the Ritz-Carlton. I did not authorize those luxury charges. And I was absolutely not financially responsible for the fraudulent actions of my adult sister. I advised him to send the bill to a collections agency or press formal theft of services charges against her. The manager's jaw dropped. He sputtered, trying to maintain his professional hospitality composure, pointing frantically at the children and reminding me that they were my blood relatives. The older police officer stepped in, his tone softening slightly. He told me he understood I was upset about the money and the deception, but right now the immediate priority was getting the kids into a safe environment. He gestured toward Leo and Mia, who were thankfully oblivious to the severe legal tension, quietly arguing over a cartoon on their screens. He asked if I had car seats in my vehicle so we could get them packed up and out of the hotel lobby. I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor. I looked directly into the officer's eyes and told him I would not be taking the children either. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the soft classical background music of the hotel lobby seemed to fade into nothingness. The officer blinked, clearly convinced he had misheard my statement. He leaned forward and politely asked me to repeat myself. I articulated every single word perfectly so there could be no misunderstanding. I told him I legally refused to take custody of those children. I did not agree to babysit. I was not consulted about this vacation. My sister left her minor children unsupervised in a public commercial building to fly out of the country. I told him that was the exact legal definition of child abandonment and criminal neglect, and I wanted to formally file charges against Jada and DeAndre right now. The second officer, a younger woman who had been standing quietly near the sofa, gasped audibly. The older officer rubbed the back of his neck, his face turning a deep shade of red. He tried to reason with me. He lowered his voice, stepping uncomfortably close, and warned me that if I walked out those glass doors without the kids, he would be legally obligated by state law to contact Child Protective Services immediately. He told me the children would be taken into state custody, placed in an emergency foster home with strangers, and it would become a massive public legal nightmare for my entire family. He was trying to give me an easy out. He was trying to protect me from the brutal reality of the foster system. But I knew the system, and I knew that if I took those kids, Jada would win. If I took those kids, I would officially become an accessory to her reckless behavior, and she would simply do this again next month and the month after that. I was not going to be the silent safety net for her maternal negligence anymore. I pulled out my business card, an expensive piece of thick, embossed cardstock, detailing my corporate firm, and handed it to the officer. I told him I understood his legal obligations perfectly. I instructed him to call Child Protective Services right away. I specifically told him to note in his official police report that the aunt arrived on the scene, identified the minor children, and formally declined custody due to criminal abandonment by the biological parents. The hotel manager looked like he was going to faint right there on the rug. The idea of government child welfare workers storming the lobby of his five-star hotel was his absolute worst public relations nightmare. He desperately offered to discount the room tab by 50% if I would just take the children and leave the premises quietly. I ignored him entirely. I walked over to the velvet sofa. I knelt down so I was eye level with Leo and Mia. My heart physically ached for them. They were innocent pawns in a sick, twisted game designed by two deeply narcissistic parents. They did not deserve this chaos. But I knew I could not save them from their mother by continuously enabling her toxic sickness. I smoothed Mia's hair back from her forehead. I told them gently that they were going to go with the nice police officers for a little while, and they needed to be very brave. Leo looked up from his tablet and asked if his mommy was coming back soon. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat and told him the truth. I said she was very far away right now, but the officers were going to keep them safe. I stood up, turned my back on the sofa, and faced the two stunned police officers. I told them my legal team would be available if the agency needed any further statements regarding Jada's exact whereabouts. But I was leaving. I walked out through the heavy glass doors, leaving the $4,000 bill, the abandoned children, and the shattered expectations of my family behind me. I knew the moment the state took custody, a timer would start. The local authorities would flag Jada and DeAndre's passports at the border. The entire church community would find out the truth about their golden child. The fallout was going to be nuclear. And for the first time in my life, I was completely ready to watch their fake empire burn to the ground. I had barely started my car engine when my cell phone illuminated with my mother's contact photo. The caller ID read, First Lady Brenda, a title she insisted everyone, even her own children, use when referring to her in public spaces. I let it ring 3 times, taking a deep centering breath to brace myself for the inevitable explosion before tapping the screen to accept the call. I did not even get a chance to say hello. My mother's voice erupted through the Bluetooth speakers of my car, shrill and dripping with absolute venom. She did not ask if Leo and Mia were safe. She did not ask if they were scared, or if they had eaten, or what the police had said to them. Her first words were a rapid string of accusations entirely centered around her public image. She screamed that the hotel manager had just called my father directly to complain about the massive scene in his lobby. She demanded to know if I had lost my mind. She yelled that I had called Child Protective Services on my own blood, and that I was actively trying to destroy the holy ministry my father had spent his entire life building. I pulled out of the Ritz-Carlton parking lot and merged onto the busy downtown streets, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead on the road. I kept my voice incredibly flat. I told her I did not abandon her grandchildren in a commercial lobby. I told her Jada did that. My mother scoffed loudly, the sound echoing harshly in the quiet cabin of my car. She said Jada was just overwhelmed and needed a small break before the new baby arrived. She told me I was supposed to be the responsible single sister, the one who handled the heavy lifting, so Jada could focus on projecting a perfect family image. She screamed that the mayor had been at the gala the night before. And if word got out that Pastor Calvin's grandchildren were sitting in a foster care facility, the church would lose its corporate sponsorships and community funding. It was always about the money with them. It was always about the optics, never about the actual human beings involved. I listened to her hyperventilate about the church's reputation for another 30 seconds. Then I spoke in a voice so devoid of emotion it surprised even me. I told First Lady Brenda that she should start praying for a very good criminal defense lawyer, instead of corporate sponsorships, because the police were already investigating her golden child for felony neglect. Before she could utter another syllable or hurl another insult, I tapped the screen and ended the call. I turned off my phone completely. I needed absolute silence to prepare for the war I knew they were going to wage against me. By the time I walked through the heavy glass double doors of my downtown public relations firm, the atmosphere was thick with frantic, chaotic energy. My executive assistant Chloe practically sprinted toward me from her reception desk. Her eyes were wide with panic and she was holding her company tablet out in front of her like it was a live explosive. She told me I needed to look at Instagram right this second. She said my sister was broadcasting live to 500,000 people and the situation was spiraling out of control. I took the tablet from her shaking hands and walked into my corner office, shutting the heavy oak door firmly behind me to block out the noise of the ringing office phones. I pressed play on Jada's live stream. The video quality was crystal clear. Jada was sitting on a plush white outdoor lounge chair. If you looked closely at the background, you could see the distinct turquoise water and swaying palm trees of the Bahamas, but she had angled the camera to focus tightly on her tear-streaked face. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and crying hysterically into the lens. It was a masterclass in digital emotional manipulation. She sobbed into the camera, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, telling her loyal followers that she was currently living a mother's absolute worst nightmare. She claimed she had left her precious children with me, her trusted sister, for a brief overnight stay, so she could get some much-needed medical rest for her high-risk pregnancy. Then, she looked directly into the camera and delivered the lie that would ignite a massive firestorm against me. She told her audience that I had suddenly suffered a severe mental breakdown. She fabricated a wild, elaborate story about how I had always been deeply jealous of her successful marriage and her beautiful children because I was a bitter, aging career woman who could not find a husband. She claimed I kidnapped Leo and Mia from her house in the middle of the night, took them to a random hotel downtown, and called the police in a manic episode to frame her out of pure, unadulterated spite. She begged her followers to pray for her babies who were now lost in the government system because of her mentally unstable, dangerous sister. I watched the live viewer count climb rapidly on the screen. 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 people were watching her lie. The comment section was a rapid blur of outrage and aggressive support for Jada. People were calling me a monster, a psychopath, and a severe danger to society. Jada was weaponizing her massive social media platform to control the narrative before the Atlanta police could release an official statement regarding the abandonment. She knew exactly what she was doing. In the influencer world, the first person to cry on camera usually wins the court of public opinion. She was willingly sacrificing my entire reputation, my safety, and my career to save her own lucrative online brand. The professional fallout was instantaneous and brutal. While Jada was still wiping her fake tears on a luxury beach in the Bahamas, the digital mob she unleashed descended upon my livelihood. Chloe knocked rapidly and opened my office door again, her face pale. She told me the company switchboard was completely overwhelmed. Members of my father's church, along with thousands of Jada's furious followers, had easily found my business contact information online. They were flooding our phone lines, screaming obscenities at my receptionist, calling our office a den of evil, and demanding that I be locked up in a psychiatric ward immediately. But the harassment did not stop at angry phone calls. My firm, Zoe Crisis Management, relied heavily on our pristine 5-star reputation to secure high-level corporate contracts. Within 45 minutes of Jada's live stream ending, our Google and Yelp business pages were hit with a massive coordinated review bombing campaign. Hundreds of 1-star reviews poured in by the minute. People who had never even stepped foot in the state of Georgia were leaving horrific defamatory comments. They wrote that I was an unethical lunatic, a child abductor, and a massive fraud who could not even manage her own family, let alone a delicate corporate crisis. They tagged my biggest corporate clients on Twitter and LinkedIn, demanding they sever all financial ties with my agency immediately or face public boycotts. The stakes had officially escalated from a toxic family dispute to a direct targeted attack on my financial independence and my life's work. My family had tried to extort $50,000 from me the night before, and now my sister was actively trying to bankrupt my entire company because I refused to be her scapegoat. The private line on my massive mahogany desk rang. It was the chief executive officer of a major tech firm, one of my highest-paying monthly retainer clients. When I answered, he sounded incredibly nervous and hesitant. He asked me what was going on with the social media trending topics. He expressed deep concern about my firm handling his upcoming initial public offering while I was suddenly embroiled in a messy, highly public child kidnapping scandal. I had to sit there and spend 20 minutes calmly reassuring him. I spoke with absolute, unwavering authority, promising him that the situation was an entirely fabricated extortion attempt by an estranged family member and would be completely legally resolved within the week. I assured him that my focus remained solely on his company's success. When I finally hung up the phone, the office was quiet, but my mind was racing. I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. For the past decade, I had built my empire by anticipating the moves of ruthless corporate saboteurs, cunning politicians, and desperate criminals. I knew exactly how to bury massive scandals, and I knew exactly how to expose them. My family had always mistaken my previous silence for weakness. They thought that because they were my blood, I would simply absorb their abuse and never use my professional arsenal against them. They truly believed they could weaponize the church congregation against me, destroy my business name, and force me to come crawling back to them begging for their forgiveness and mercy. I reached forward and opened my secure laptop. I pulled up my encrypted investigative database. I did not feel hurt anymore. The lingering sadness of having a family that hated me was completely gone, replaced by something much colder and far more dangerous. I felt calculating, sharp, and laser-focused. If Jada and my parents wanted a public crisis, they had messed with the wrong woman. I was going to give them a terrifying masterclass in absolute destruction. I closed my laptop, grabbed my tailored coat from the back of my door, and took the private elevator down to my building's parking garage. The Atlanta Police Department had requested my physical presence at the precinct to sign my formal statement, and I was not going to delay the legal process by a single minute. The drive through downtown traffic gave me time to lock away any remaining slivers of daughterly guilt. By the time I parked my car across the street from the grim concrete police station, my mind was a fortress of legal strategy and risk assessment. Walking into a central police precinct is an assault on the senses. The air always smells faintly of stale coffee, cheap floor wax, and human desperation. The harsh fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting a sickly pale glow on everyone inside. It was the absolute last place you would expect to find the polished elite royalty of Atlanta's megachurch scene. But the moment I pushed through the heavy metal doors, I heard him. My father's booming theatrical voice was echoing off the cinderblock walls of the crowded lobby. Pastor Calvin was holding court at the front desk, dressed in a flawless navy blue custom suit that probably cost more than the duty sergeant's annual salary. Beside him stood my mother, First Lady Brenda, wearing a wide-brimmed church hat and oversized designer sunglasses indoors, desperately trying to hide her face from the random citizens sitting in the waiting area. They looked entirely out of place, like actors who had wandered onto the wrong movie set, but they were using every ounce of their social capital to control the room. My father was leaning aggressively over the high counter, pointing a manicured finger at a highly irritated desk sergeant. He was not asking for information. He was issuing pastoral commands. I stood quietly by the entrance, watching the sheer arrogance unfold. He told the sergeant that there had been a massive misunderstanding and that he needed the entire Child Protective Services file shredded immediately. He name-dropped the mayor. He casually mentioned how many thousands of voters sat in his pews every Sunday. He reminded the officers that his church hosted the annual police charity drive and strongly implied that their funding would dry up overnight if they did not release his grandchildren to him and wipe Jada's record clean. My mother chimed in, her voice shrill and trembling with indignation. She demanded to speak to the chief of police. She said it was a criminal outrage that a family of their spiritual magnitude was being subjected to government bureaucracy just because a confused young mother took a brief vacation. The detectives looked exhausted. They were clearly uncomfortable with the political pressure being applied. In Atlanta, crossing a prominent black megachurch pastor could stall a police officer's career, and my father knew exactly how to wield that unspoken threat. He was a master of using his holy platform for unholy intimidation. I did not announce myself. I bypassed the spectacle at the front desk entirely and walked straight toward the holding area doors, where the lead investigator, Detective Miller, was waiting for me. He looked deeply relieved to see someone acting like a rational adult. He quickly ushered me into a small windowless interview room away from my parents' loud lobbying. Inside the quiet room, I sat across from the detective and gave my official statement. I was clinical precise and entirely devoid of emotion. I handed over the high-resolution photographs I had taken of Jada's handwritten note at the hotel. I provided the exact timestamps of when I arrived at the Ritz-Carlton and when I departed. I gave them the name of the hotel duty manager, who had witnessed the entire interaction. I clearly reiterated that I had no prior knowledge of my sister's travel plans and had never consented to assume guardianship of her children. Detective Miller typed furiously on his keyboard. He looked up at me, his expression caught somewhere between professional detachment and personal sympathy. He warned me that my parents were threatening to file a counter-complaint against me for making a false police report. He said they were trying to convince the precinct captain that I was mentally unstable and had orchestrated the entire hotel incident to ruin my sister's life. I did not flinch. I told the detective to let them try. I reminded him that hotel security cameras do not lie and airline flight manifests are federal records. Jada checked out. Jada got on a plane and Jada left her kids. I signed my printed statement with a steady hand, thanked the detective for his time, and stood up to leave. I knew the hardest part of the afternoon was waiting for me just outside that door. When I stepped out of the interview room and walked down the long, narrow cinder-block hallway toward the exit, they were waiting for me. My father stood dead center in the corridor, physically blocking my path to the lobby doors. My mother hovered just behind his shoulder, glaring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Without the audience of the front desk officers, the fake pastoral charm vanished completely from my father's face, replaced by a cold, hard fury I had known my entire life. He stepped forward, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. He lowered his voice to a dangerous, gravelly whisper so the passing officers would not hear him. He asked me if I was proud of myself. He asked if I felt like a big, powerful corporate executive now that I had thrown my own flesh and blood to the wolves. I stopped walking, leaving exactly 2 feet of space between us. I looked him dead in the eyes and maintained perfect, relaxed posture. I told him I simply told the truth, and if the truth felt like being thrown to the wolves, perhaps his golden child should have made better choices. My mother gasped, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. She hissed that I was a bitter, wicked girl. She said I was destroying the family name out of petty jealousy. My father held up a hand to silence her. He was not interested in emotional outbursts. He wanted compliance. He leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive cologne completely overwhelming the stale air of the hallway. He laid out his ultimatum with chilling precision. He told me I was going to fix the massive mess I had created. He instructed me to immediately hire the most ruthless, expensive criminal defense attorney in Atlanta to represent Jada. He demanded I pay the legal retainer up front. Then he said I was going to log on to my social media accounts and issue a public apology video. I was going to tell the world that I had suffered a stress-induced breakdown, that Jada was an innocent, devoted mother, and that the entire Ritz-Carlton incident was my fault. If I refused, he promised to destroy everything I had built. He smiled a tight, vicious smile. He reminded me that he had the ear of every major Black CEO, politician, and community leader in the metropolitan area. He said he would stand at his pulpit this coming Sunday and declare my public relations firm to be untrustworthy and unethical. He promised to launch a quiet, systematic boycott across his entire network until every single one of my corporate clients dropped my agency. He told me he would bankrupt me by the end of the fiscal quarter. He told me he would reduce me to absolutely nothing. He expected me to tremble. He expected me to cave under the sheer weight of his community influence. Instead, I let out a short, genuine laugh. The sound echoed sharply in the dreary hallway, catching him entirely off guard. I looked at this man, this holy man who had spent his life preaching about grace while ruling his household with an iron financial fist. The hypocrisy was so blinding it was almost comical. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every word landed like a precise surgical strike. I told him he could not bankrupt me because I actually knew how to manage my assets. I reminded him of the year I turned 18. I reminded him how he sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that the church could not spare a single dollar from my college tuition because I needed to learn the value of hard work. I worked 2 grueling jobs. I ate cheap ramen noodles for 4 years. I stayed in the university library until 2 in the morning because I could not afford the electricity bill in my off-campus apartment. I paid for my own textbooks, my own graduation gown, and my own startup costs when I launched my firm. Then I shifted my gaze to my mother. I asked her if she remembered what happened the exact same year I graduated with honors. They took $200,000 of family funds and handed it directly to Jada so she could open a luxury baby boutique in a high-rent district. A boutique that Jada ran straight into the ground in less than 8 months because she refused to show up for work. They rewarded her incompetence with endless cash, and they punished my independence with absolute neglect. I turned my focus back to my father. The anger in his eyes was flickering, replaced by a sudden flashing realization that he no longer held any leverage over my life. I was not a vulnerable college student begging for a loan anymore. I was a millionaire who fixed disasters for a living, and he had just declared war on me. I stepped smoothly around him, clearing his physical blockade with effortless grace. I paused just before pushing open the heavy metal door that led back to the lobby. I looked over my shoulder at the two of them standing frozen in the bleak police station hallway. Save your sermons, Pastor. I deal with real crises. I pushed through the heavy metal doors of the precinct and stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. The threat my father had just leveled against me would have paralyzed an ordinary person, but I was not ordinary. I built my career dissecting the hidden lives of powerful people. I knew that when a narcissist threatens your livelihood, you do not cower. You immediately dismantle their power source. I drove back to my downtown office, bypassed the frantic energy of my staff, and locked myself inside my executive suite. I instructed Chloe to hold all non-emergency client calls and ordered a pot of black coffee. It was time to go to work. My parents were actively trying to paint me as an unstable kidnapper to the police and Child Protective Services. I knew exactly how CPS operated. They would investigate my background, my home, and my finances. To clear my name permanently and prove my sister was the actual negligent party, I needed irrefutable documentary evidence. I needed to show the authorities exactly who Jada and DeAndre really were behind their carefully curated online facade. I opened my encrypted laptop and started making calls. Over the past decade, I had cultivated an elite network of private investigators, forensic accountants, and cybersecurity experts who specialized in tracking hidden assets for corporate divorces and hostile takeovers. I dialed Marcus, a former federal fraud investigator who now worked as my lead independent contractor. I gave him Jada and DeAndre's full legal names and told him I needed a comprehensive deep dive into their financial history. I wanted every bank account, every tax return, every limited liability company, and every digital footprint they had left over the past 5 years. Marcus told me it would take a few hours to bypass the standard firewalls, but he promised to deliver a full dossier by midnight. I spent the rest of the evening managing my existing client accounts, projecting absolute calm while my personal life was effectively a war zone. Just after 11 o'clock, a secure encrypted file landed in my private inbox. I downloaded the massive folder, poured myself another cup of coffee, and began analyzing the data. What I found was not just standard financial mismanagement. It was a massive, highly illegal house of cards. Jada and DeAndre were not just living beyond their means, they were completely legally bankrupt. According to the sealed federal court filings Marcus had unearthed, they had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 2 years ago. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the massive suburban house Jada constantly flaunted on her Instagram channel were all heavily leased, mortgaged to the hilt, or currently in the pre-foreclosure process. But the most damning revelation was DeAndre's so-called crypto empire. My father had stood in front of the entire congregation and demanded I give $50,000 to DeAndre's new youth crypto ministry. The financial documents painted a terrifying picture of exactly what that ministry actually was. DeAndre had set up a classic textbook Ponzi scheme. He was using his position as the pastor's son-in-law to solicit investments from vulnerable elderly church members. He promised them guaranteed high returns on obscure digital currencies. In reality, there was no crypto investment portfolio at all. He was simply taking the cash from new investors to pay off the early investors, skimming massive amounts off the top to fund Jada's lavish influencer lifestyle. He was actively defrauding the very congregation my father claimed to protect. The sheer audacity of it made my blood run cold. They were not just terrible parents. They were white-collar criminals operating openly under the holy protection of my father's megachurch. No wonder they were so incredibly desperate to force me to write that $50,000 check at the gala. The Ponzi scheme was collapsing. The early investors were demanding their money back, and DeAndre needed a massive influx of clean cash to prevent the entire fraudulent operation from being exposed to federal authorities. I kept digging my eyes, scanning through hundreds of pages of bank statements and wire transfers. I needed to establish exactly how a bankrupt couple with no legitimate income had managed to book a luxury suite at the Ritz-Carlton and purchase first-class international flights to the Bahamas. I opened the section of the dossier containing their recent travel expenses and internet protocol logs. Marcus had managed to pull the exact digital receipts for the vacation. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the information staring back at me. The flights, the hotel tab, the expensive room service, the premium spa treatments, they were not paid for with stolen church funds or Ponzi scheme money. They were charged to an exclusive black-tier credit card. The billing name on the digital receipt was Zoe. My name. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, convinced I was misreading the document. I pulled up the attached credit report Marcus had run on the card number. The account was fully active, boasting a massive credit limit, and it was registered entirely under my full legal name and my highly confidential social security number. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. They had not just tried to extort me at a public gala. They had not just abandoned their children and attempted to frame me for kidnapping. They had literally stolen my identity. Jada and DeAndre had been flying around the world drinking expensive champagne and living a fake billionaire lifestyle on a credit card legally tied to my personal financial record. I felt a sickening drop in my stomach as the pieces slammed together. The Ritz-Carlton manager had asked me which credit card I wanted to use to resolve the $4,000 balance. He already had a card on file with my name on it. Jada had confidently left that note because she knew the hotel would eventually just charge the card they used for the booking. She only wanted me there to physically collect the children so she could escape the legal consequences of leaving them alone. She was using me as a free babysitter while simultaneously robbing me blind. I immediately logged into my secure credit monitoring service, a premium software I used to protect my wealthy clients. I ran a comprehensive sweep of my own social security number. The progress bar loaded slowly each second, feeling like an eternity. When the final report generated, I felt a cold, sharp rage settle into my bones. The black tier card used for the Bahamas trip was not the only anomaly. It was just the tip of a massive, horrifying iceberg. There was a labyrinth of unauthorized financial activity attached to my identity, but to understand the full scope of the devastation, I had to look past Jada and DeAndre. I had to look at the people who gave them the keys to my life. The digital IP addresses used to initially open that fraudulent credit card did not originate from Jada's house. They originated from the private pastoral office of my father's megachurch. I sat alone in my dark office, the glow of the computer screen illuminating the absolute ruins of my family loyalty. My sister was a fraud, her husband was a scam artist, and my parents were deeply complicit in an elaborate financial crime against their own daughter. They had mistaken my independence for ignorance. They thought they could use my pristine credit score to fund their circus while treating me like garbage. I reached for my phone and dialed Marcus again. It was past midnight, but he answered on the first ring. I told him we were no longer just building a defensive file for Child Protective Services. I told him we were preparing a massive federal-level offensive. I instructed him to freeze every single unauthorized account attached to my social security number immediately. I told him to trace every single dollar that had been spent, transferred, or borrowed in my name over the past 10 years. I was not going to simply clear my name with the police anymore. I was going to meticulously document every single fraudulent transaction, every fake signature, and every stolen dime. Jada wanted to use her social media platform to call me a mentally unstable criminal. My father wanted to use his pulpit to destroy my business. I was going to let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could. I was going to let them stand before their adoring fans and their loyal congregation wrapped in their fake holy righteousness. And then I was going to use their own financial records to bury them alive. The morning sun crept over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, harsh shadows across my office floor. I had not slept a single minute. I sat exactly where I was the night before, staring at the digital walls closing in on me. I knew Marcus was an exceptional investigator, but this escalating situation required an entire army of specialists. At 8 o'clock sharp, I picked up my phone and made two critical calls. The first was to David, a ruthless forensic accountant who usually dismantled complex offshore tax evasion schemes for Fortune 500 companies. The second was to Vince, a retired federal agent turned private investigator who specialized in severe identity theft and high-level white-collar crime. By noon, my pristine executive suite had been entirely transformed into a secure war room. We pulled the heavy blinds down, plunging the room into artificial light. We covered the massive glass conference table with thick printed spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and deeply buried property records. I told David and Vince to treat my life like a hostile corporate takeover. I wanted every single stone unturned. I needed to know exactly how deep the financial rot went. David started mapping out the financial timeline on a large whiteboard. He meticulously cross-referenced the IP addresses from the church pastoral office with my personal credit history. What we initially thought was just one black-tier credit card used for a luxurious Bahamas vacation quickly blossomed into a terrifyingly complex web of financial deceit. It was not a recent mistake or a sudden moment of desperation. It was a calculated, cold-blooded operation that spanned more than a decade. Vince pulled up a series of scanned loan applications from the digital archives. He pointed a laser pointer to the date stamped on the top right corner of the very first document. It was the exact month of my 18th birthday. I felt a freezing chill run down my spine as I looked at the signature line on the screen. It was my name forged in a handwriting that looked eerily similar to my own, but with the distinct, elegant loops my mother used when she signed the weekly church bulletins. First Lady Brenda had not just stood by silently while my father cut me off financially. She had actively preyed on my newly acquired legal adult status. Vince explained the mechanical precision of the crime. When I was 18, living in my childhood bedroom, working 2 jobs, and studying tirelessly to earn my college scholarships, my mother had unrestricted access to my highly sensitive documents. She had my original birth certificate, my physical social security card, and complete control over the household mail. She used my pristine, untouched credit profile to open her first fraudulent account. She secretly opened a private post office box across town under my name to intercept all the paper bank statements, ensuring I would never see the bills arriving at the house. From there, the theft multiplied like a malignant, aggressive virus. We traced a series of massive personal loans taken out in my name over the years. The dates of the wire transfers matched perfectly with my mother's most extravagant public purchases. That designer wardrobe she flaunted every single Sunday to make the other church wives fiercely jealous was bought entirely with my stolen credit. The custom luxury SUV she drove to high-profile charity events was leased strictly under my social security number. The diamond tennis bracelet she wore when she shook hands with the mayor was paid for by the daughter she constantly belittled. But the ultimate betrayal did not stop with her own narcissistic vanity. David uncovered a massive commercial line of credit secured directly against my identity. The funds from that massive account had been systematically drained and transferred into a separate obscure business account. I recognized the routing number instantly. It was the primary operating account for Jada's failed luxury baby boutique. My parents had proudly told me and everyone else in our social circle that they used their own hard-earned family funds to give Jada $200,000 to start her business. That was a complete, sickening lie. They had secretly saddled me with the crippling debt to fund Jada's absolute failure. Every single time Jada mocked me for working too hard, every time she called me a bitter career woman, she was doing it while actively burning through money stolen directly from my legal name. She played the successful entrepreneur while I was unknowingly financing the entire theatrical production. For hours, the three of us sat in the suffocating room tracking the endless flow of stolen money. My parents had been expertly juggling minimum payments for years. They constantly moved massive debt from one fraudulent card to another, promotional balance transfer offer, desperately keeping the accounts just current enough to avoid triggering aggressive collections or legal action. Because my actual legitimate corporate income was so high, the banking algorithms kept automatically extending the credit limits, completely unaware that the person spending the money was an imposter sitting comfortably in a mega-church office. At 4 in the afternoon, the room fell dead silent. David put his dry erase marker down. He drew a heavy red circle around a final combined number at the bottom of the whiteboard. I stared at the red ink, my breath completely catching in my throat. My hands gripped the edge of the glass table so hard my fingers ached. $1,200,000. I was unknowingly carrying $1.2 million in fraudulent toxic debt. The sheer magnitude of the number was paralyzing. My entire financial future, the safety net I had sacrificed my youth to build, the security I had worked 80-hour weeks to secure, was a complete and utter illusion. If the delicate house of cards my mother had built suddenly collapsed, if she missed even 1 month of those massive minimum payments because church donations dipped, the banks would come directly after me. They would seize my business assets, drain my legitimate savings accounts, garnish my corporate wages, and force me into absolute bankruptcy. My parents had essentially placed a loaded financial gun to my head without me ever knowing it. And they were holding the trigger. The sheer scale of the sociopathy required to do this to your own child was entirely incomprehensible to a rational mind. They stood on that massive church stage every single Sunday preaching loudly about integrity, sacrifice, and unbreakable family values. They judged their congregation harshly for their sins. They demanded heavy tithes from working-class families who could barely afford groceries. They projected a flawless image of divine blessing and supreme moral authority to the entire city of Atlanta. But underneath the expensive tailored suits, the wide-brimmed hats, and the holy rhetoric, they were calculated parasites. The church's shiny, perfect image was built entirely on the secret destruction of my financial life. My father had threatened to bankrupt me just hours ago at the police precinct if I did not pay for Jada's lawyer. He did not need to threaten me. He and my mother had already bankrupted me on paper. They had stolen my past, hijacked my present, and mortgaged my future. Vince closed his laptop slowly. He looked at me with deep professional concern. He asked me if I wanted him to immediately draft the formal criminal referral for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He warned me, his voice gravelly and serious, that once we submitted the official paperwork to the federal authorities, there was absolutely no turning back. The federal government takes identity theft and wire fraud extremely seriously, especially when it crosses state lines and involves over $1 million. Vince laid out the brutal reality of the next steps. He told me my mother would be facing severe mandatory federal prison time. My father would likely be indicted as a top-level co-conspirator for utilizing the stolen funds. DeAndre would be swept up in the investigation for the crypto Ponzi scheme and the credit card fraud. The megachurch would completely collapse under the crushing weight of the federal investigation and the subsequent media circus. He asked me to take a long moment to deeply consider the massive emotional weight of sending my own parents and my brother-in-law to federal prison. I looked away from the glaring whiteboard and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I looked down at the busy moving traffic of the Atlanta streets below. I thought about the thousands of hours I had worked to prove my worth to people who never actually cared about me. I thought about the sheer terror I felt when my parents coldly told me they would not help me pay for my education. I thought about the police officers holding those 2 abandoned toddlers in the hotel lobby. I thought about how my family treated me like an unwanted defective outcast while secretly draining my lifeblood to fund their golden child. They had never once considered the emotional weight of destroying me. They had never hesitated to throw me to the wolves to protect their image. I turned back to Vince and David. My vision was perfectly clear. I did not shed a single tear, and my voice did not tremble. I told Vince to prepare the federal criminal referral and have it ready for my signature. I told David to compile every single forged signature, every digital IP log, and every fraudulent bank statement into a massive, undeniable binder of hard evidence. I was not going to let the FBI handle this quietly behind closed doors. My family loved an audience. They thrived on public attention. They loved using the sacred setting of the church to publicly humiliate me and demand my absolute compliance. So I was going to give them exactly what they loved. I was going to let them put on their fancy Sunday clothes, gather their adoring fans, and step proudly onto their holy stage. I was going to let them believe they had won, and then I was going to tear their fake parasitic empire down brick by brick in front of the entire world. Have you ever realized that the people who prayed over you were the same ones preying on you? It is a deeply terrifying revelation when you finally understand that the holy hands that supposedly anointed your head are the exact same hands that actively picked your pockets while your eyes were closed in prayer. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments right now. If you have ever survived family financial abuse, if you have ever had your credit score ruined, your savings drained, or your identity stolen by the very people who were supposed to protect you, hit the like button. You are absolutely not alone in this fight. Now let me tell you exactly how I burned their entire fraudulent kingdom to the ground. When you discover that your own parents have stolen over $1 million from you, the natural human instinct is to completely explode. You want to drive over to their massive, perfectly manicured suburban house, kick their heavy mahogany front door wide open, and scream until your vocal cords bleed. You want to confront them aggressively, demand immediate explanations, and watch them squirm under the crushing weight of their own guilt. But guilt requires a functional conscience, and my parents had already proven beyond any reasonable doubt that they did not possess one. If I confronted them immediately, they would simply deny everything. My father would use his immense community power and political connections to bury the evidence. And my mother would likely try to destroy the physical financial documents before the federal agents could secure a proper search warrant. I could not afford to act on pure, reckless emotion. I am a professional crisis manager. I know that the most dangerous person in the room is never the one yelling the loudest. It is the one taking detailed notes in absolute terrifying silence. So, I decided to put on the greatest poker face of my entire life. As I sat in my darkened office finalizing the federal criminal referral strategy with Vince and David, my cell phone buzzed aggressively on the glass conference table. It was a rapid barrage of text messages from First Lady Brenda. She was still completely unaware that I had uncovered the massive credit card fraud and the identity theft. She was still operating under the arrogant delusion that her biggest problem was the hotel incident and the child abandonment police report I had filed against Jada. Her texts were an absolute masterclass in narcissistic manipulation and religious guilt-tripping. She wrote that I was breaking my father's heart and destroying his health. She said the entire church board of directors was already murmuring about my rebellious, ungodly behavior at the gala. She demanded that I immediately transfer the massive $50,000 retainer fee for Jada's criminal defense attorney and write a public apology statement on my business letterhead. She threatened that if I did not comply by Sunday, I would be permanently exiled from the family and publicly excommunicated from the congregation. I picked up my phone and carefully crafted my response. I did not type out my burning rage. I did not mention the $1.2 million in fraudulent debt they had secretly strapped to my name. Instead, I channeled the frightened, submissive, obedient daughter they always demanded I be. I typed slowly, intentionally, making my tone sound defeated. I told her that the aggressive police precinct environment had overwhelmed me. I said I was just feeling incredibly stressed about my corporate workload and that my emotions had gotten the better of me at the hotel when I saw the kids. I told her I was deeply sorry for causing a public scene at the gala and that I simply needed a few days to get my personal finances in order so I could help Jada properly pay for her legal defense. It was physically sickening to press send on those cowardly words. My stomach turned at the thought of groveling to the woman who had stolen my identity, but the strategy worked perfectly. My mother replied almost instantly, and her tone immediately shifted from frantic aggression to smug, triumphant superiority. She told me she knew I would eventually see reason and remember my proper place in the family hierarchy. She praised the Lord for softening my stubborn heart and instructed me to bring the lawyer's retainer check directly to the church administrative office on Sunday morning. I simply replied that I would see her then. With those few carefully calculated submissive text messages, I effectively and completely disarmed them. I lulled my family into a false sense of absolute security. They truly thought they had successfully broken my spirit. They thought their secret financial empire was completely safe from scrutiny. While they were busy celebrating my ultimate submission and frantically planning Jada's legal defense strategy to beat the Child Protective Services charges, I was methodically preparing their absolute financial and legal destruction. For the next 3 days, my executive suite functioned as a covert military intelligence base. Chloe, my assistant, canceled all my non-essential client meetings and guarded my office door fiercely. David, my forensic accountant, worked around the clock with barely any sleep to compile the raw financial data into an airtight, irrefutable legal format. We did not just print out basic bank statements. We created a comprehensive, heavily indexed binder of hard evidence that would make any federal prosecutor immediately jump out of their chair. We organized the thousands of documents chronologically, starting from the very first fraudulent credit application submitted when I was exactly 18 years old. We color-coded every single illicit wire transfer that moved from my stolen commercial credit lines directly into Jada's failed luxury baby boutique account. We highlighted the exact dates and specific dollar amounts that perfectly matched my mother's luxury vehicle lease payments and her high-end designer wardrobe purchases. We documented every single time my father used funds from my stolen credit line to pay for his expensive pastoral retreats and customized suits. Vince brought in a certified, independent handwriting expert to officially verify that the signatures on the original loan documents were clear, undeniable forgeries executed directly by my mother. We legally pulled the digital internet protocol logs, showing that the exclusive black-tier credit card used for the Bahamas baby moon had been accessed repeatedly from DeAndre's personal laptop and my father's secure church office network. Every single lie they had ever told to me, to their congregation, and to their community was now backed by cold, hard, unshakable legal documentation. There was absolutely no room for creative misinterpretation. There was no possible way my charismatic father could spin this narrative from his wooden pulpit. It was pure, unadulterated financial treason committed against their own blood. During those 3 agonizing days of intense, obsessive preparation, I had to completely compartmentalize my feelings. It was an exhausting psychological exercise. I forced myself to continue going to my regular high-stakes corporate client meetings. I smiled warmly at my staff in the hallways. I drank my morning coffee and calmly reviewed complex public relations strategies for tech companies as if my entire personal life was not completely imploding. But underneath the polished professional corporate exterior, I was a loaded weapon waiting patiently for the exact right moment to fire. Whenever a wave of sorrow hit me, whenever I felt the lingering, painful thought that I was actively working to send my own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary, I pushed it away. I reminded myself that they stopped being my family the exact moment they decided my total financial ruin was an acceptable price to pay to maintain their luxurious, fake lifestyle. By late Friday evening, the ultimate weapon was finally complete. The final binder was 4 inches thick, bound in heavy black leather, and weighed almost as much as the crushing emotional burden they had placed on my shoulders for the past decade. Vince placed the completed federal criminal referral paperwork neatly on top of the black binder on my glass conference table. He looked at me, giving me a silent nod of deep, professional respect. I picked up my favorite gold-plated fountain pen, took one last deep breath, and signed my name firmly on the dotted line. I had officially initiated the federal investigation into my own parents and my sister's husband. But I was not going to simply hand the heavy binder over to the federal authorities and wait quietly in the shadows for the justice system to slowly turn its wheels. I needed my family to feel the exact same suffocating public humiliation they had actively tried to force on me at the church anniversary gala. They had aggressively demanded a public apology. They had demanded that I stand before their wealthy donors and their loyal congregation to claim I was the crazy, unstable, jealous sister. They wanted a spectacular public show to save their reputation. I decided it was only fair to give them the absolute greatest, most unforgettable performance the church community had ever witnessed. I locked the heavy black binder securely inside my office wall safe, activated the complex security alarm, and prepared my mind for the weekend. The trap was fully set, the undeniable evidence was perfectly secured, and the arrogant golden child and her enablers were about to come crashing down. Early Saturday morning, the reality of the situation finally caught up with Jada and DeAndre in the most brutal way possible. They had just landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport after their luxurious week in the Bahamas. I can only imagine how smug they must have felt walking off that plane deeply tanned wearing their expensive resort wear, fully expecting to return to their heavily subsidized suburban life without facing a single consequence. Jada was probably already planning her next social media post, ready to spin a dramatic story about her traumatic but necessary mental health break. But the moment they scanned their passports at the Customs and Border Protection checkpoint, the automated system flashed a hard red warning light. They were not greeted by an apologetic airline employee or a private chauffeur. They were immediately flanked by 2 armed federal customs agents and 3 officers from the Atlanta Police Department. The officers did not care about Jada's massive social media following or my father's prestigious pastoral title. They pulled my sister and her husband out of the premium passenger line in front of hundreds of staring travelers. They escorted them into a stark windowless security room in the back of the airport. According to the police report I would later read, Jada immediately started screaming that she was a highly respected public figure and demanded to call her lawyer. The lead detective calmly instructed her to sit down and formally informed them that they were currently under criminal investigation for felony child abandonment. He told them that their 2 minor children were currently in the legal custody of the state of Georgia and that their passports were being temporarily flagged to prevent any further international travel. The sheer panic must have been completely intoxicating. For the very first time in her 33 years of life, Jada was facing a massive life-altering problem that my parents could not simply pray away or pay to disappear. The police informed them that because the investigation was active, they would not be immediately arrested at the airport, but they were legally required to present themselves at the precinct by Monday morning with legal representation. They were also strictly forbidden from contacting the foster family currently housing Leo and Mia. They walked out of that airport totally stripped of their arrogant armor. They were terrified, desperate, and backed entirely into a legal corner. And they knew exactly who they needed to manipulate to get out of it. I was sitting in the quiet serenity of my downtown penthouse, sipping a cup of hot black coffee and watching the morning news when my secure intercom system buzzed aggressively. The concierge working the front desk of my building sounded incredibly tense when I answered. He apologized for the interruption and told me that my sister and a gentleman were in the lobby causing a severe disturbance. He said they were frantically demanding to be led up to my private floor and asked if I wanted him to call building security to have them forcibly removed from the premises. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I had been waiting for this exact moment. I told the concierge to let them in and grant them access to the private elevator. I placed my ceramic coffee mug on the kitchen island and walked over to my living room. I quickly pulled my cell phone from my pocket, opened the voice memo application, and hit the red record button. I slipped the recording device face down onto the glass coffee table, completely hidden in plain sight next to a stack of architectural magazines. I smoothed out my silk lounge set, took a deep centering breath, and waited for the show to begin. The heavy oak doors of my penthouse swung open, and Jada and DeAndre practically fell into my foyer. The physical transformation from the arrogant, entitled couple I had faced at the church gala was genuinely shocking. Jada looked completely unhinged. Her expensive hair extensions were a tangled mess, her designer sunglasses were pushed askew on top of her head, and her face was blotchy and red from crying genuine tears of absolute terror. DeAndre looked like a cornered animal. His fake, confident swagger was entirely gone, replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. His expensive linen vacation shirt was deeply wrinkled, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected the police to jump out of my hallway closet. The moment Jada saw me standing calmly in the center of the living room, the tone flipped entirely. Gone was the vicious woman who had thrown a heavy crystal wine glass at my head. Gone was the entitled golden child who had told her 500,000 internet followers that I was a deranged, jealous kidnapper. She rushed forward, threw her designer tote bag onto the floor, and actually dropped to her knees in front of my expensive Italian leather sofa. She started sobbing hysterically, reaching out to grab the fabric of my pants. She begged me to help her. She cried that the police were trying to take her babies away forever, and that the state investigators were treating her like a hardened criminal. She pleaded with me, her voice cracking with desperate emotion, swearing that she had never meant for things to escalate this far. She said she was just so overwhelmed by her pregnancy and the stress of DeAndre's business that she made a stupid, impulsive mistake. She told me I was the only person in the world who could save her family from being completely destroyed. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent her entire life making me feel completely worthless. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not offer her a tissue. I just stared at her with blank professional detachment. I told her to get up off my floor and explain exactly what she wanted me to do about a criminal charge that she brought upon herself. DeAndre stepped forward urgently, pulling Jada up by her arm and sitting her heavily on the edge of the sofa. His hands were shaking visibly. He reached into his wrinkled jacket pocket and pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled legal document. He smoothed it out on my glass coffee table right next to my secretly recording cell phone. It was a formal typed affidavit, hastily drafted by whatever desperate defense lawyer my father had managed to retain for them over the weekend. Jada looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. She explained the plan with breathless desperation. She told me that her lawyer said the entire child abandonment charge hinged completely on my police statement. If I continued to maintain that I had absolutely no prior knowledge of their vacation, she would definitely face felony charges and likely serve time in a state penitentiary, but she said, if I simply signed this sworn affidavit, the entire case would fall apart. The document legally stated that Jada and I had a firm verbal agreement prior to her departure. It stated that I had formally agreed to babysit Leo and Mia at the Ritz-Carlton, and that my subsequent refusal to take custody of them was simply a sudden, unexpected family miscommunication rather than a criminal act of parental abandonment. She was actively asking me to commit perjury. She was begging me to lie to the federal authorities, to the state child welfare agency, and to a judge, all to shield her from the legal consequences of her own horrific actions. She told me that if I just signed the paper, the police would drop the charges, CPS would release the kids back to her immediately, and we could put this entire ugly nightmare behind us as a family. She promised she would never ask me for another favor for the rest of her life. She swore she would publicly retract the terrible things she said about me on her social media accounts and tell everyone that I was the hero who saved her children. I picked up the document and slowly read through the dense legal paragraphs. The sheer audacity of the request was staggering. They wanted me to take the absolute full blame for the situation. If I signed this document, I would look like an incompetent, unreliable aunt who had carelessly allowed a massive police response to occur simply because I changed my mind about babysitting. It would permanently validate every single lie she had told her followers about my mental instability. I placed the paper back on the glass table. I looked DeAndre directly in the eyes, playing the role of the confused, hesitant victim perfectly. I kept my voice soft and slightly trembling. I told them that I could not possibly sign a legal document claiming we had a prior arrangement when they had left me with a massive $4,000 hotel bill. I reminded them that the police knew exactly how they had paid for the room and the flights. I asked them directly, feigning deep emotional hurt, why they had used a credit card with my name on it, if this was just a simple family misunderstanding. DeAndre immediately jumped at the opportunity to smooth things over. This was his territory. He was a professional scam artist, and he truly believed he could talk his way out of any corner if he just applied enough fake charm. He let out a nervous chuckle, waving his hand dismissively in the air, as if credit card fraud and identity theft were just minor administrative errors. He stepped closer to me, putting on his best, most sincere pastoral smile. He looked at me and delivered a line so incredibly delusional, so deeply steeped in manipulative gaslighting that it practically took my breath away. He told me I was overthinking the financial side of things. He said, "We are family, Zoe. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is ours. We only used that specific card because we knew it had a massive rewards multiplier for international travel. We did not want to steal from you. We actually used your card to get the travel points for you. We thought you would be happy to see those bonus miles hitting your account. It was supposed to be a win for everybody." I stared at him in complete stunned silence. He was standing in my living room facing federal wire fraud charges, trying to convince a professional financial fixer that he had stolen my identity and booked a luxury vacation strictly as a thoughtful favor to help me build my frequent flyer miles. The sociopathic logic was so deeply embedded in his brain that he actually thought I was stupid enough to accept that explanation. I did not scream. I did not throw them out of my penthouse immediately. I let his ridiculous, incriminating excuse hang in the quiet air of the living room for a few long seconds, knowing that my phone was capturing every single crystal-clear syllable of his confession. I looked down at the recording device hidden among the magazines, then back up at my desperate sister and her scam artist husband. They thought they were inches away from salvation. They thought my silence meant I was considering their absurd offer. They had absolutely no idea that they had just walked willingly into a steel trap, and I was finally ready to snap it shut. I let my shoulders slump forward, releasing a long, shaky breath that sounded remarkably like total defeat. I raised both of my hands to my face, rubbing my temples and squeezing my eyes shut just hard enough to force a single convincing tear to trace its way down my cheek. When I finally opened my eyes, I looked at Jada and DeAndre with an expression of complete and utter exhaustion. I let my voice waver, slightly breaking at the perfect intervals. I told them I was so incredibly tired. I said I was tired of fighting my own blood, tired of the endless family drama, and utterly terrified at the thought of Leo and Mia sleeping in a cold, unfamiliar foster care facility with strangers. I told them they had won. Jada let out a massive, dramatic gasp of relief. She lunged forward, grabbing my hands in hers, her eyes shining with sudden, victorious tears. The sheer speed at which she switched from a terrified criminal to a loving, grateful sister was almost clinically fascinating to watch. She squeezed my fingers tightly, telling me I was doing the right thing, the righteous Christian thing. She promised me that God would severely bless my sacrifice and that our parents would secretly praise my deep loyalty to the family name. She swore that things would be different from now on, that we would finally be the tight-knit family we were always meant to be. It was a beautiful, entirely fabricated speech. I gently pulled my hands away from her eager grasp. I reached into the breast pocket of my silk lounge shirt and pulled out a silver pen. I leaned over the glass coffee table, bringing the metal tip of the pen just millimeters away from the signature line on the legal affidavit. DeAndre leaned forward on the sofa, his eyes practically glowing with greedy anticipation. He was holding his breath, waiting for the ink to secure his freedom. But right before the pen touched the paper, I stopped. I pulled my hand back and let out a deeply frustrated sigh, shaking my head as if a terrible thought had just occurred to me. I looked at DeAndre, furrowing my brow in feigned panic. I told him we still had a massive logistical and legal problem that signing this paper would not fix. I explained that because the credit card company had already flagged the $4,000 Ritz-Carlton charge as highly suspicious, my dedicated wealth management banker was actively investigating the entire account. I told him that my bank employed extremely aggressive fraud prevention algorithms. If I simply paid off the massive hotel balance and the Bahamas flights right now, Without providing a highly plausible, detailed explanation, the bank's internal fraud department would immediately lock down the card and freeze all my corporate assets pending a federal inquiry. I put on my very best face of innocent, desperate confusion. I told DeAndre that I needed to call my private banker first thing on Monday morning and claim I had personally authorized the whole thing. But I explained I could not successfully lie to the bank unless I knew exactly how the account was originally set up and accessed. The bank would ask me security verification questions about the origin of the charges. I looked at DeAndre and actively stroked his fragile masculine ego. I told him I knew he was incredibly tech-savvy to bypass a major banking institution's security firewall. I said I was honestly amazed he managed to pull it off so smoothly. I asked him to walk me through every single step of his operational process so I could repeat his exact methods to the fraud department, verify the charges, and make the entire police investigation disappear permanently. DeAndre physically relaxed. The tense, cornered animal posture completely vanished. He let out a loud, boastful laugh, clearly absolutely thrilled that a successful corporate executive like me was finally acknowledging his supposed brilliance. He sat back heavily against the cushions of my expensive Italian leather sofa, crossing his ankle over his knee like a wealthy CEO giving a masterclass on high-level finance. He completely took the bait. He started talking, his voice dripping with arrogant pride, while Jada nodded along in silent, supportive agreement. He told me it was actually incredibly easy once you had the right inside connection and a little bit of technical know-how. He leaned forward and explicitly explained that my mother, First Lady Brenda, had carefully retained unauthorized copies of my original birth certificate, my physical Social Security card, and my old high school banking details. She kept them secured in her locked personal filing cabinet inside the main church administrative office. He proudly detailed how Brenda had practiced forging my signature on blank printer paper for weeks until her handwriting was an absolutely flawless match to mine. He explained that my mother used her respected position as the pastor's wife to intercept any stray mail sent to their house, ensuring the initial credit applications went entirely unnoticed by me. Then DeAndre shifted the focus to his own criminal contributions. He wanted all the credit for the digital heist. He told me he set up a highly encrypted proxy server using the church's private internet network to mask his actual location and IP address. He created a fake email account using a slight variation of my middle name and birth year to intercept and bypass the bank's digital security alerts. He chuckled a dark, sickening sound as he recounted how he easily answered all my strict security questions because he obviously knew my mother's maiden name, the name of my first childhood pet, and the exact street I grew up on. He detailed exactly how he logged into the secure banking portal, authorized the black-tier credit card for the Bahamas trip, and actively manipulated the massive wire transfers to funnel the cash directly into his failing crypto accounts. He bragged about overriding the two-factor authentication by linking a burner phone to the account profile. He confessed to absolutely everything, every specific date, every digital method, every forged document, and every stolen dollar. He was so incredibly eager to prove his superior intelligence to me that he happily outlined a textbook case of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy right in the middle of my living room. He implicated himself. He implicated his wife, who was sitting right next to him, and he completely implicated our mother. He finished his grand monologue with a highly satisfied smirk. He gestured casually toward the printed affidavit resting on the table, telling me that all I had to do was sign the paper, call the bank with his brilliant cover story, and we would be one big happy family again. He assured me he would handle the kids and the police once my signature was on the page. I looked at the legal document. I looked at Jada, who was already mentally planning her triumphant victimhood return to her social media followers. Then I set my silver pen down on the glass table. The soft, sharp click of the metal hitting the thick glass seemed to echo incredibly loudly in the quiet room. My physical posture completely transformed in a fraction of a second. The slumped shoulders vanished. The fake tears dried instantly. I stood up straight, radiating the icy, calculating, merciless authority that my corporate clients paid my firm millions of dollars to deploy against their worst enemies. I reached over to the stack of glossy magazines. I picked up my cell phone, turned the bright screen directly toward them, and pressed the red square to stop the voice memo recording. I tapped the screen once more to hit the play button. DeAndre's arrogant, boastful voice instantly filled the room, crystal clear and undeniable, explaining exactly how First Lady Brenda had forged my signature. I let the recording play for 10 excruciating seconds before pausing it. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. All the color rapidly drained from Jada's face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very sick. DeAndre completely froze, his boastful smirk collapsing violently into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. His eyes darted from the phone in my hand to my cold, unblinking face. They finally realized exactly what they had just done. They had handed me the murder weapon with their own fingerprints all over it. I looked down at them, feeling completely invincible. My voice was cold and hard as steel, echoing in the luxurious space. I told them there would be no signed affidavit today. I told them there would be no paid hotel bill, no cover story with the bank, and absolutely no family reconciliation. I informed them that I now possessed a legally binding, extremely detailed audio confession of their massive federal crimes, and I had already retained the best forensic accountants in the state. I pointed my finger firmly toward my heavy oak front door. I told them they had exactly 30 seconds to get out of my penthouse before I called the building security team and the Atlanta Police Department to have them immediately arrested for trespassing and attempted extortion. Jada opened her mouth to scream, to cry, to beg again, but no sound came out. DeAndre scrambled off the sofa, grabbing his wife by the arm and dragging her toward the foyer. They stumbled out the door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind them, leaving me alone in the absolute quiet of my victory. The trap had worked perfectly. I locked the door behind them, walked back to my living room, and immediately uploaded the audio file to 3 separate secure cloud servers. I forwarded a copy directly to Vince, my private investigator, with a single sentence attached. "The final nail is ready. The final nail is ready." But as satisfying as it was to know Jada and DeAndre were legally trapped, they were merely symptoms of a much larger disease. The true architect of my misery, the man who had enabled the financial abuse and orchestrated the toxic dynamic of our family, was my father. Pastor Calvin ruled his megachurch with absolute authority. His pulpit was his throne, and the massive, glittering building was his impenetrable fortress. If I wanted to completely dismantle the cycle of abuse, I could not just cut off the branches. I had to rip the entire operation out by the roots. I needed to destroy his fortress. On Monday morning, while my parents undoubtedly thought I was busy lying to my bank to cover up their crimes, I initiated a deep dive into the corporate structure of my father's church. Most people in Atlanta assumed Pastor Calvin owned the sprawling worship center outright. He certainly acted like he did. He constantly bragged about the multi-million-dollar renovations, the state-of-the-art sound system, and the massive crystal chandeliers that hung in the fellowship hall. He spoke of the building as his personal legacy, a monument to his supreme spiritual leadership. But I am a financial fixer. I know that highly narcissistic people often project massive wealth to hide massive liabilities. I accessed the county commercial property records database and began tracing the parcel numbers tied to the church's address. It took less than an hour to uncover the massive, embarrassing truth my father had spent a decade hiding from his congregation. Pastor Calvin did not own a single brick of that building. The megachurch was entirely a facade built on rented ground. The property was actually owned by a massive commercial real estate conglomerate called Apex Holdings, headquartered in Chicago. My father was nothing more than a glorified commercial tenant locked into a highly restrictive 30-year triple-net lease. This revelation completely changed the battlefield. My father derived all his community power from that specific location. If he lost the building, he would lose the congregation, the massive weekly tithes, and his pristine public image. I immediately instructed David, my forensic accountant, to shift his focus from my stolen credit cards to the financial health of Apex Holdings and their Atlanta portfolio. What David found by Tuesday afternoon was the absolute ultimate vulnerability. Apex Holdings was currently undergoing a massive corporate restructuring. They were aggressively liquidating their underperforming assets across the Southeast region to free up liquid capital. And my father's megachurch was sitting right at the very top of their underperforming list. David pulled the internal financial filings that Apex had submitted to the commercial real estate database. The documents painted a picture of absolute financial desperation on my father's part. Because DeAndre's crypto Ponzi scheme was rapidly collapsing, and because my mother was constantly draining the church's operating funds to pay the minimum balances on my stolen credit cards, the church was completely broke. They were severely bleeding cash. In fact, Pastor Calvin was currently 3 full months behind on his massive commercial rent payments. Apex Holdings had already issued 2 private notices of default. They were actively preparing to evict the church, but they were hesitant to initiate the highly public, messy legal process of throwing a prominent black megachurch out onto the street. Apex simply wanted to sell the defaulted lease contract to a third-party debt buyer, wash their hands of the massive headache, and recoup whatever pennies on the dollar they could. I sat in my office staring at the commercial default notices on my computer screen, feeling an overwhelming surge of absolute power. My father had stood in the police precinct hallway just days ago, puffed up his chest, and threatened to use his network to bankrupt my business. He tried to intimidate me with his massive wealth and his holy authority. He had no idea that his entire empire was currently sitting on the real estate chopping block, completely exposed and up for grabs to the highest bidder. I picked up my secure office phone and called my elite corporate real estate attorney, a ruthless negotiator named Harrison. I did not tell Harrison this was a personal family vendetta. I framed it strictly as a highly aggressive, time-sensitive corporate acquisition. I instructed Harrison to immediately set up a blind trust and register a completely anonymous limited liability company in the state of Delaware. We named the shell corporation Vanguard Horizon Equities. The Delaware registration would guarantee absolute ironclad anonymity. My name would not appear on a single public document. Once the LLC was legally established, I authorized Harrison to contact Apex Holdings directly. I told him to make an aggressive all-cash offer to purchase the entire defaulted lease portfolio containing my father's church. Apex Holdings was absolutely thrilled to hear from us. They were desperate to offload the toxic asset. Their corporate brokers eagerly sent over the massive stack of commercial lease contracts, the building blueprints, and the default history. Harrison ruthlessly negotiated the purchase price down, using the church's severe financial delinquency as massive leverage. Because I was offering a lump sum of clean liquid cash to close the deal within 48 hours, Apex agreed to sell the property rights and the active lease contract at a steep discount. By Thursday morning, the final acquisition contracts were drafted and waiting on my glass conference table. I had spent years building a massive, highly diversified personal investment portfolio. I had millions in liquid cash reserves legally earned through relentless hard work, late nights, and brilliant corporate strategy. While my sister was buying fake designer bags with stolen money and my father was begging for donations, I was quietly building a financial fortress of my own. I authorized the massive wire transfer from my private wealth management account to the escrow company. The money cleared immediately. I picked up my gold fountain pen and signed my name on the final acquisition documents as the sole managing director of Vanguard Horizon Equities. The transfer of power was completely silent. There were no trumpets, no dramatic announcements, and no public spectacles. But in that exact moment, the dynamic of my entire life fundamentally shifted. I had just purchased the physical ground my father stood on. I owned the massive fellowship hall where Jada had thrown wine at me. I owned the sanctuary where my parents stood every Sunday to preach their hypocritical sermons. I owned the pastoral office where my mother had secretly forged my signature to steal my identity. I was now legally Pastor Calvin's landlord. And he had absolutely no idea. He was still operating under the arrogant delusion that I was a frightened, submissive daughter desperately trying to fix his financial messes with the bank. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his holy kingdom was protected by his powerful friends and his charismatic voice. He did not realize that the deed to his kingdom was currently sitting locked inside a fireproof safe in my downtown penthouse. Harrison called to confirm the final deed recording with the county clerk. He asked me how I wanted to proceed with the delinquent tenant. He noted that because the church was already 3 months in default on the rent, I had the immediate legal right to serve a commercial eviction notice. He offered to send a standard warning letter to give them a chance to pay the massive back rent. I told Harrison to hold off on the warning letters. A standard corporate warning would just give my father time to scramble, manipulate his congregation, and beg for emergency donations. I did not want to give him a single second to prepare. I wanted the absolute element of surprise. This coming Sunday was the highly anticipated 15th anniversary gala of the megachurch. It was the absolute biggest day of my father's professional calendar. He had invited the mayor, local politicians, wealthy corporate donors, and hundreds of loyal church members. It was supposed to be his crowning moment of glory. He had explicitly instructed me to bring the $50,000 legal retainer check for Jada directly to the altar during the service. He planned to use the massive public setting to force my submission exactly like he tried to do the week before. I smiled, leaning back in my ergonomic desk chair, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I was absolutely going to attend that anniversary service. I was going to walk down that plush carpeted aisle in my best tailored suit, but I was not bringing a check for my sister. I was bringing the full crushing weight of the United States legal system. I called Vince, my private investigator, and gave him the final green light. I told him to coordinate directly with his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the local fraud detectives. I provided them with the exact time and location of the Sunday service. I told them exactly where Jada DeAndre and First Lady Brenda would be sitting. The pieces were perfectly set on the board. My parents had spent my entire life treating me like an insignificant pawn, useful only for their financial gain and emotional punching bag. But while they were busy playing checkers, I had mastered chess. I had quietly surrounded their king, cut off their financial escape routes, and legally purchased the very board they were playing on. I spent the rest of Friday reviewing the massive black binder of financial evidence one last time. Every forged signature, every stolen dollar, every arrogant audio confession was perfectly categorized. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. For 29 years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. For 29 years, I had accepted their cruelty because I believed blood meant obligation. But as I closed the heavy leather binder, I realized that true freedom does not come from waiting for toxic people to suddenly realize your value. True freedom comes from completely stripping away their power to ever hurt you again. Sunday was rapidly approaching. My father was preparing his most triumphant sermon. Jada was preparing her fake tears. My mother was preparing to accept the praises of the congregation, and I was preparing to deliver a checkmate they would never, ever forget. Sunday morning arrived with a blindingly bright Georgia sun, casting a golden hue over the massive glass facade of the megachurch. The parking lot was already overflowing with luxury vehicles, a clear testament to the wealth my father demanded from his congregation. The 15th anniversary gala was not just a regular Sunday service. It was a highly orchestrated political and social event designed to cement Pastor Calvin's absolute authority in Atlanta. Ushers dressed in pristine white suits directed the thousands of attendees into the massive sanctuary. The room was a masterclass in theatrical opulence featuring towering crystal chandeliers, state-of-the-art acoustics, and 2 massive high-definition LED screens flanking the central wooden altar. I walked through the heavy wooden doors just as the choir began their opening hymn. I did not wear the subdued conservative dresses my mother always forced on me to make me look like a compliant background character. I wore a flawless, custom-tailored crimson-red suit. It was the color of absolute power. It was a visual declaration of war. I walked down the center aisle, my high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor before hitting the plush red carpet of the VIP section. I took my seat in the second row, placing my heavy leather designer bag carefully on the pew next to me. Inside that bag was the thick black binder of financial evidence, a sleek digital USB drive, and the commercial property deed that legally proved I owned every single inch of the building we were currently standing in. The front row was a sea of local power brokers. The mayor of Atlanta sat dead center, flanked by two city council members and a prominent state senator. My father had invited them specifically to show off his immense political muscle and community influence. To the right of the politicians sat my family. My mother, First Lady Brenda, was draped in expensive designer silk, wearing a massive, elaborate church hat that I now knew was paid for with my stolen identity. She waved graciously to the congregation, completely blind to the federal net closing around her. Next to her sat Jada and DeAndre. They looked absolutely terrible. Despite the heavy professional makeup Jada had plastered on her face, her eyes were bloodshot and swollen from days of frantic crying. DeAndre was sweating profusely through his expensive custom suit. He kept checking his watch and shifting nervously in his seat. They had spent the last 48 hours living in a state of pure terror after I kicked them out of my penthouse with their recorded confession. They were likely praying that my father could pull off a massive public miracle today and bully me into silence before the police acted on the child abandonment charges. The music swelled to a dramatic crescendo, and Pastor Calvin stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. The congregation rose to their feet in a massive wave of applause. My father soaked in the adoration, raising his hands to silence the room with practiced, charismatic ease. He began his sermon with sweeping rhetoric about the history of the church, the obstacles they had overcome, and his grand vision for the future. He paced back and forth across the massive stage, his voice booming through the $1 million sound system. After 45 minutes of triumphant preaching, the tone of his voice suddenly shifted. The energetic, booming cadence dropped into a soft, serious, and deeply emotional register. He walked back to the center of the altar, gripped the sides of the podium, and looked out over the sea of faces. He began talking about the sacred institution of the family. He told the congregation that the devil was constantly working to tear righteous families apart through vicious rumors, jealousy, and financial hardship. He spoke about how true Christian love requires massive sacrifice, endless forgiveness, and total submission to pastoral authority. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of cold stone. I knew exactly what was coming. This was the ambush. My father looked directly down at me in the second row. The camera operator immediately swung the massive crane camera in my direction, and my face was instantly projected onto the two 50-foot LED screens flanking the altar. A collective hush fell over the thousands of people in the room. Pastor Calvin spoke directly into his microphone, his voice echoing with heavy, calculated emotional weight. He told the congregation that his family was not immune to the attacks of the enemy. He vaguely referenced the swirling rumors regarding Jada and DeAndre, framing their horrific child abandonment as a simple, stressful misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion by malicious gossip. Then he pivoted to me. He announced that his youngest daughter, Zoe, a highly successful corporate executive, was sitting in the audience today to publicly demonstrate the unbreakable bond of their family. He did not ask me to come up. He commanded it. He raised his hand, pointing directly at me, and called me up to the altar. He told the thousands of people watching that I was coming forward to publicly forgive my sister for any recent misunderstandings, but more importantly, he announced that I was coming forward to present a massive $50,000 seed money donation to officially launch DeAndre's new youth crypto ministry. He framed it as an ultimate act of familial healing and spiritual obedience. It was a brilliant, incredibly toxic psychological trap. He was using the heavy peer pressure of the holy setting, the presence of the mayor, and the watchful eyes of thousands of congregants to completely corner me. In his arrogant mind, there was absolutely no way I would dare cause a massive public scene and humiliate the family in front of the city's political elite. He fully expected me to walk up those stairs, hand over a massive check I never agreed to write, hug the sister who had tried to frame me for kidnapping, and smile for the church photographers. My mother turned around in her front row seat and looked at me. She gave me a tight, demanding smile, her eyes silently screaming at me to obey. Jada stood up, placing a hand over her pregnant belly, already squeezing out fake, trembling tears of gratitude for the cameras. I slowly stood up from the wooden pew. I picked up my heavy leather bag. The congregation erupted into thunderous emotional applause. People were wiping tears from their eyes, completely captivated by the beautiful story of family redemption my father was spinning. I stepped out into the center aisle and began walking toward the stage. Every step I took felt incredibly powerful. The psychological weight that had crushed me for 29 years was completely gone. As I walked up the plush red stairs to the elevated altar, I looked down at the floor beneath my expensive heels. I felt a surge of pure electric adrenaline. My father thought he was calling me onto his holy stage to establish his dominance. He had absolutely no idea he was actually inviting me onto my own commercial property. I reached the center of the altar and stood face to face with Pastor Calvin. He was beaming, radiating fake pastoral love for the cameras. He stepped out from behind the acrylic podium and pulled me into a brief, rigid hug. As he leaned in, pressing his face next to my ear where the microphones could not pick up his voice, his tone turned absolutely venomous. He whispered sharply that I better have the check in my hand and that I better smile and read the script perfectly, or he would personally ensure my business was ruined by tomorrow morning. He pulled back, smiling broadly for the thousands of people watching, and handed me his wireless microphone. The congregation fell into a breathless, expectant silence. They were waiting for me to weep, apologize, and hand over my hard-earned money to fund a criminal Ponzi scheme. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone. I did not look at my father. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I looked out over the massive crowd, making brief eye contact with the mayor in the front row. Then I lifted my gaze all the way to the back of the massive sanctuary, up to the second-floor balcony, where the glass-enclosed audio and visual booth was located. My father thought he controlled everything in this building, but I am a crisis public relations expert. I never walk onto a stage I do not completely control. Early that morning, before the doors even opened to the public, I had paid a personal visit to Julian, the head audio engineer of the church. Julian was a brilliant young tech guy who was severely underpaid and deeply despised my father's arrogant treatment of the church staff. For $10,000 in clean, untraceable cash, Julian had gladly agreed to temporarily hand over the entire $1 million audiovisual system to me. I stood in the center of the stage wearing my crimson suit, holding the microphone. The silence in the massive room was stretching on just a few seconds too long. My father shifted nervously beside me, sensing that something was fundamentally wrong with my posture. I was not trembling. I was not reaching into my bag for a checkbook. I was standing with the absolute, terrifying confidence of a woman holding a lit match in a room full of gasoline. I looked directly at Julian through the glass window of the sound booth at the back of the room. I gave him a single sharp nod. It was the signal. The ambush was officially over, and the execution was about to begin. I held the microphone close to my mouth and looked directly at my father. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. True Christian love does require honesty. It requires bringing the darkness into the light. I turned to face the congregation, making sure to project my voice clearly and evenly across the massive sanctuary. I announced that instead of a monetary donation, I had decided to give my family and this church something infinitely more valuable. I was giving them the absolute, unfiltered truth. I lowered the microphone. Up in the sound booth, Julian pushed the master fader up. Instantly, the $1 million sound system crackled to life, bypassing the choir microphones and the podium audio. DeAndre's arrogant, boastful voice boomed through the massive overhead speakers, echoing off the stained glass windows and the high vaulted ceilings. The audio quality was pristine. Every single syllable of his confession from my living room was magnified 100 times over. The congregation heard him laugh, a dark and sickening sound, as he proudly explained how First Lady Brenda had carefully kept my original birth certificate and Social Security card locked in her pastoral office. They heard him explicitly detail how my mother had relentlessly practiced forging my signature on blank printer paper until it was a flawless match. The entire sanctuary sat in stunned, paralyzed silence as DeAndre's recorded voice bragged about bypassing the bank's security firewall to steal my identity. But the recording did not stop at the financial crimes. Julian expertly queued up the second audio file. Now the congregation heard Jada's desperate, panicked voice. They heard her confess to leaving her 5-year-old and 3-year-old children completely unsupervised in the Ritz-Carlton lobby so she and DeAndre could fly to the Bahamas on my stolen black tier credit card. They heard her begging me to sign a fake legal affidavit to help her commit perjury and avoid state prison time for child abandonment. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. A collective gasp ripped through the thousands of people packed into the pews. It sounded like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the massive room. The mayor sitting in the front row physically recoiled, his face turning a sickly shade of ash gray. He immediately stood up, signaling to his security detail that he needed to evacuate the premises immediately to avoid the impending political fallout. The city council members scrambled over each other to follow him out of the VIP section. My father was violently shaking. He lunged toward the clear acrylic podium, frantically pressing the mute buttons on the audio console hidden beneath the surface, completely unaware that Julian had entirely overridden the stage controls from the booth. Pastor Calvin yelled into his dead microphone, his face purple with rage, commanding the audio team to cut the power, but his voice barely carried past the first few rows. The booming recording of his son-in-law confessing to federal wire fraud completely drowned him out. Down in the front row, the reality of her total destruction finally hit Jada. The fake pious smile she had worn just minutes ago had completely vanished. She looked around at the thousands of congregants who were now staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. These were the same people who had blindly followed her mommy influencer social media accounts. Now they were loudly murmuring, pointing fingers and shaking their heads. Jada panicked. She grabbed her designer purse, shoved DeAndre hard in the chest, and scrambled out of the pew. She was making a desperate run for the side exit doors located near the choir loft. But before Jada could even take 10 steps down the carpeted aisle, the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the main sanctuary swung open with a loud, resounding crash. The bright morning sunlight flooded into the back of the room, casting long silhouettes down the center aisle. A team of 12 men and women in dark suits and tactical windbreakers stepped into the church. The bold yellow letters FBI were printed clearly across the backs of the lead agents' jackets. Flanking them were uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department and 2 plainclothes detectives from the Financial Fraud Division. The low murmur of the congregation instantly erupted into absolute chaos. People were standing up in their pews, pulling out their smartphones and recording the unprecedented spectacle. The holy sanctuary had officially transformed into a live crime scene. The federal agents did not rush. They walked down the long, plush red carpet of the main aisle with slow, deliberate, terrifying authority. The sea of churchgoers parted instantly, terrified of getting in the way of a federal raid. Detective Miller, the same investigator I had spoken to at the precinct, led the local police unit straight toward the altar. I stood perfectly still in the center of the stage, watching the tactical team approach. I reached into my heavy leather designer bag and pulled out the massive 4-inch thick black binder. It contained every forged document, every digital IP log, and the complete financial timeline of the $1.2 million they had stolen from me. I walked over to the clear acrylic podium, standing right next to my hyperventilating father, and dropped the heavy binder onto the surface. The massive thud echoed loudly over the stage. I looked down at my mother, who was sitting frozen in the front row. She was gripping the wooden pew in front of her so hard, her knuckles were completely white. I leaned over the edge of the stage and spoke directly to her, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the room. I told her that her beautiful designer church hat looked absolutely stunning today, but it was a shame she bought it with my stolen credit score. I told her the bill was finally due. The federal agents reached the front of the sanctuary. 2 heavily armed FBI agents immediately surrounded DeAndre. He did not put up a fight. He looked completely hollowed out, staring blankly at the marble floor as they aggressively spun him around and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was loud enough for the first 5 rows to hear. The lead agent loudly informed DeAndre that he was being placed under federal arrest for wire fraud conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Jada screamed. It was a piercing, guttural shriek of absolute terror. She tried to run toward her husband, but a female Atlanta police officer intercepted her, grabbing her tightly by the arm. The officer informed Jada that she was being taken into custody regarding the active child welfare investigation and her outstanding warrants for felony child abandonment. But the ultimate crescendo of the morning was reserved for First Lady Brenda. Detective Miller stepped directly in front of her. My mother tried to stand up tall, desperately attempting to utilize her holy authority one last time. She puffed out her chest and indignantly told the detective that she was the first lady of this ministry, that she demanded respect, and that they had absolutely no legal right to interrupt a sacred worship service. Detective Miller did not even blink. He pulled out a folded federal warrant from his jacket pocket and held it directly in front of her face. He told her that he did not care if she was the Queen of England. He stated clearly for everyone in the front rows to hear that Brenda was being placed under arrest for massive identity theft, bank fraud, and the forgery of over $1 million in fraudulent commercial loans. My mother completely lost her mind. The polished, elegant facade she had maintained for decades shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. She started thrashing wildly, screaming obscenities that no pastor's wife should ever know, let alone scream inside a sanctuary. 2 officers had to physically restrain her, as they forced her arms behind her back and snapped the heavy handcuffs onto her wrists. Her massive, expensive designer church hat was knocked askew, eventually tumbling off her head and landing on the floor, where it was immediately trampled by the boots of the arresting officers. My father was having a complete mental breakdown on the stage next to me. He was grabbing his hair, pacing frantically, and shouting at the police that they were destroying his life's work. He demanded they unhand his wife. He screamed that he was Pastor Calvin, a pillar of the Atlanta community, and that there would be massive political consequences for this outrage. The lead FBI agent looked up at my father on the stage. The agent calmly advised him to remain silent and secure legal counsel immediately, as his name was heavily implicated in the financial routing of the stolen funds. The agent warned my father that a federal subpoena for all church financial records was already being executed in the administrative offices down the hall. I stood there in my crimson suit, completely untouched by the chaos swirling around me. The congregation was in an absolute frenzy, shouting, crying, and filming the arrests. The flashing red and blue lights from the dozens of police cruisers parked outside were visibly pulsing through the massive stained glass windows, casting an eerie, chaotic glow over the entire fellowship hall. I watched as the police physically dragged my sister, my brother-in-law, and my mother down the center aisle. The very same aisle my father had expected me to walk down in total submission. They were paraded in front of the thousands of people they had lied to, manipulated, and defrauded. There was no dignity left. There was no holy respect. They were exposed as the parasitic criminals they truly were. My father finally stopped pacing. He turned to me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute hatred and profound disbelief. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. He told me I was a monster. He said I had destroyed my own family and burned down the house of God just to satisfy my selfish, bitter ego. I looked at this broken, arrogant man. The man who had refused to pay for my college. The man who had threatened to destroy my career. The man who had watched his wife steal my identity and actively benefited from the crime. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, sharp edge of total victory. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space just like he had done to me at the police precinct. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely impassive. I told him he was wrong. I told him I did not burn down the house of God. I simply called the exterminators to take out the pests. My father stared at me, his chest heaving violently, his face contorting into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure wrath. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He raised his hands, pointing his shaking fingers toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary, and screamed with every ounce of air left in his lungs. He told me I was officially banished from his church. He declared that I was no longer his daughter, no longer a member of his holy flock, and permanently exiled from the house of the Lord. He commanded me to turn around, walk out of his sacred building, and never show my face in his presence again. I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly grounded on the plush red carpet of the altar. I smiled. It was a slow, genuine smile of absolute, undeniable victory. I reached back into my heavy leather designer bag and pulled out a crisp white manila envelope. I slipped my hand inside and retrieved the thick stack of legal documents, complete with the official county clerk's gold foil seal stamped firmly on the front page. I stepped right up to the clear acrylic podium, casually pushing his leather-bound sermon notes aside, and placed the heavy documents squarely in front of him. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable for the remaining congregants and the stunned church board members to hear. I told him he was severely mistaken. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Actually, Calvin, this is my building now." He stopped breathing. He looked down at the documents, his eyes darting rapidly over the heavy black text. I explained exactly how I had used an anonymous limited liability company to purchase the entire commercial lease portfolio from his corporate landlord in Chicago. I watched the horrifying realization wash over his face as he recognized my signature at the bottom of the property deed as the sole managing director of Vanguard Horizon Equities. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a cold, authoritative whisper that echoed through the massive speakers. I reminded him that he was currently 3 full months behind on his massive commercial rent payments. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the top document of the stack. I told him this was a formal, legally binding eviction notice. I told him he had exactly 7 days to clear his personal belongings out of his extravagant pastoral office and completely vacate my property. He staggered backward, as if I had physically struck him across the face. The booming, charismatic megachurch pastor was entirely gone, replaced instantly by a broken, hyperventilating old man who suddenly realized he had absolutely nothing left in the world. The few remaining church elders who had not fled during the federal police raid walked up to the altar. They took one look at the formal eviction notice, glanced at the massive binder of financial fraud evidence I had left on the stage, and turned their backs on him in absolute silent disgust. His entire empire, built on decades of manipulation and stolen money, evaporated into thin air in less than 20 minutes. 6 months have passed since that explosive Sunday morning, and the dust has finally settled over the absolute ruins of my former family. The federal justice system moves quickly when you hand them a perfectly organized, airtight binder of financial evidence and crystal-clear audio confessions. DeAndre pled guilty to federal wire fraud conspiracy and aggravated identity theft. He did not have a fancy defense lawyer because the massive retainer fee never arrived. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary in Florida. There are no cryptocurrency mixers in prison. There are no expensive linen vacation shirts or luxury watches. He wears a standard-issue khaki uniform and works in the prison laundry facility for less than $1 an hour. The arrogant smirk he wore in my living room has been permanently erased. My mother, First Lady. Brenda managed to avoid a federal prison cell solely due to her advanced age and her sudden willingness to fully cooperate with the prosecutors against her own son-in-law. However, the judge did not let her walk away freely. She was sentenced to 3 years of strict federal house arrest and ordered to pay massive financial restitution. She was forced to move out of the sprawling suburban colonial house after the bank foreclosed on it. She now lives in a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her massive collection of expensive designer church hats and luxury silk dresses are completely useless to her now. She wears a bulky black GPS ankle monitor strapped to her leg. The tight-knit church community she used to look down upon now relentlessly gossips about her spectacular fall from grace. She is a prisoner in her own home, entirely stripped of the glamorous public image she stole my identity to create. The most tragic yet entirely earned downfall belonged to Jada. The golden child lost absolutely everything. When the Atlanta Police Department finalized their child abandonment investigation, Child Protective Services permanently removed Leo and Mia from her care. The state formally placed the children in the custody of DeAndre's parents, who turned out to be incredibly stable, hardworking people who were completely horrified by the criminal actions of their son and daughter-in-law. Jada's lucrative social media influencer career completely imploded overnight. When the news of the hotel abandonment and the credit card fraud leaked to the public, her 500,000 followers turned on her with vicious speed. Every single one of her corporate brand sponsors dropped her contracts immediately. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy. Today, my 33-year-old sister works the late-night shift at a fast food drive-through window just to make enough money to pay her court-ordered legal fines. The woman who once threw a crystal wine glass at me because she thought she was vastly superior is now handing out paper bags of French fries through a sliding glass window. As for Pastor Calvin, the megachurch board of directors held an emergency meeting the very next day and officially voted to dissolve his ministry entirely. They stripped him of his pastoral title and completely excommunicated him from the community network he had spent his life building. He lost his massive six-figure salary, his private office, and his unquestioned authority. The wealthy politicians and corporate donors who used to line up to shake his hand completely stopped returning his phone calls. He lives alone in a small rental unit, an angry, bitter man preaching to completely empty walls. I did not sell the massive church building. I had an entirely different vision for the property. Over the past 6 months, I hired an elite architectural firm to completely gut the massive fellowship hall and the main sanctuary. We ripped out the heavy wooden pews and the acrylic pulpit. We kept the beautiful crystal chandeliers and the towering stained glass windows. But we transformed the massive interior space into sleek, modern glass-enclosed collaborative workspaces and executive offices. Today, that building is officially the headquarters of the Vanguard Horizon Business Incubator. I turned the exact location of my deepest family trauma into a massive, heavily funded resource center exclusively designed to support Black women entrepreneurs. We provide aggressive startup grants, elite financial literacy training, and top-tier legal assistance to women trying to build their own independent businesses. I took a place that was actively used to drain my resources and transformed it into a powerful fortress of financial empowerment. I walk through those heavy glass doors every single morning, watching brilliant, driven women building their dreams, knowing that they will never have to depend on a toxic family member for their survival. The healing process has been profound and entirely unexpected. I used to think that cutting off my family would leave me feeling incredibly isolated and alone in the world. I thought the absence of my parents and my sister would create a massive, unfillable void in my life. But what I actually discovered was that their absence created an abundance of beautiful, quiet peace. I sleep soundly through the night. My corporate public relations firm has tripled in revenue because I am no longer carrying the exhausting psychological weight of their constant demands and their financial crimes. I am surrounded by a chosen family of brilliant colleagues, loyal friends, and the inspiring women who work in my building. The greatest lesson I learned from the absolute destruction of my biological family is that loyalty should never be a suicide pact. You are under no spiritual or moral obligation to set yourself on fire simply to keep your toxic relatives warm. When people show you exactly who they are, when they show you that they value their public image and their financial greed over your basic humanity, you have to believe them the very first time. You have to be willing to walk away from the table when respect is no longer being served. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. You just have to provide the garbage bag. Have you ever had to legally protect yourself from your own parents? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories of surviving toxic families and building an unstoppable life on your own terms. Thank you for watching. And remember to always protect your peace and your credit score.